Cuban Missile Crisis, 14th to 28th of October of 1962. That's when and where the world could have suffered no ordinary military conflict but the first nuclear warfare ever. How did we get so close in human history to such a conflict? First of all, let's take a step back and discuss the diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, Castro came into power overthrowing Batista's regime. Since this change at the top had happened in the context of the Cold War, the US and the CIA under Eisenhower's administration decided that action was necessary. 10 months after the revolution, and just 3 months after Kennedy became president, the CIA attempted a coup which was passed down in history as the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, the attempt failed because the Cuban Authority already knew of the plan and the CIA underestimated Cuban resistance, which became even more powerful thanks to aid from the USSR. It was on this occasion that Cuba decided to get closer in relations with the Soviet Union for political and economic reasons. They actually needed protection from American danger and economic guarantees due to the embargo being imposed by the US on Cuba. Now, because of the failed US attempt to overthrow Cuba's leader and Jupiter missiles being installed in Italy and Turkey, the USSR and Cuban leaders Khrushchev and Castro secretly met in June 1962 and decided to install missiles in Cuba as a response to the US actions. There were 3 main strategic reasons. Since 1962, the US has had the advantage of possessing the first nuclear strike, while the USSR had only 20 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Nevertheless, their poor accuracy raised questions, and they had the option of placing missiles in other territories. Cuba was somehow the perfect option. Khrushchev thought that after the US had found out about the missiles, he could have negotiated with them in order to unify East Germany and West Germany under one socialist state. Lastly, the USSR feared the numerous threats to Cuba from the US, and the overthrow of the revolutionary government would have meant a serious defeat for the socialist cause. On September 2nd, intermediate ballistic missiles, which were capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, came into Cuba's territory, and the US had already suspected that there was something going on. In fact, the CIA had been spying on the meeting between Che Guevara and Khrushchev, and the director of the CIA had written a memorandum to Kennedy about the possibility that the USSR was installing missiles in Cuba. The first photographic proof of the US came to light on the 14th of October, and after examining the photos on the 16th of October, President Kennedy was eventually informed. The very same day, a decision-making body was created, the ExComm, and they discussed the various possibilities they had in order to give a strong response to this close-range threat, while also considering the possibility of a war between the two superpowers. On the 20th of October, the ExComm took their decision, and a naval blockade of the island of Cuba soon came into force. Nonetheless, the members of ExComm thought that this wasn't enough and that nuclear war was imminent. Khrushchev was rapidly informed that if the USSR had responded to the naval blockade, the US would have been ready to react. This situation made Khrushchev propose compromises, which allowed the US to have a more influential role in the negotiations. On the 26th of October, Fekelsov, the KGB station chief in Washington, played an important role when he met John Scully, correspondent for ABC News, for lunch, and asked him if he could talk with someone Scully knew in the State Department to see if diplomatic compromises were possible. According to Scully, Fekelsov's proposal was to dismiss the Soviet bases in return for the US not invading Cuba. Later that day, Kennedy received a personally written letter from Khrushchev in which he stated, "We, for our part, we declare that our ships bound for Cuba will not carry any kind of armaments. You will declare that the United States will not invade Cuba with its forces and will not support any sort of force that might intend to carry out an invasion of Cuba. Then the necessity for the presence of our military specialists in Cuba would disappear." The letter was examined, and bearing unforeseen circumstances, Kennedy was willing to accept that proposal. The following day, the 27th of October, would become known as Black Saturday. That day, Fidel Castro was convinced that an invasion from the US would have happened and wrote a letter to Khrushchev in which he said that if the US had invaded Cuba, that would have been in the name of self-defense, the moment to attack. A new message from Khrushchev was broadcast by Moscow radio. And now the Soviet leader said that the USSR would have accepted to remove missiles only if Turkey removed them too. A complex scenario opened up for ExCom. They agreed that missiles in Turkey weren't useful anymore, but Turkey didn't want to remove them. They thought that it would have damaged the reputation of the Atlantic Alliance. McNamara's advice, it was decided to ask Italy to also eliminate the Jupiter missiles in order to put pressure on Turkey. And U-2 was also sent to monitor the operations of Soviet missiles, but it was shot in Cuban territory. The ExCom assumed that the attack had been ordered by the Kremlin and speculated that the move was designed to escalate the crisis. However, President Kennedy decided not to retaliate and just agreed that if any other surveillance planes had been fired over Cuba, the sites would have been attacked. Later that day, the ExCom again reviewed various options for the following day, including ordering an airstrike on the missile sites in Cuba and extending the blockade to oil and lubricants, while without the knowledge of the other members of the ExCom, President Kennedy and Dean Rusk were preparing a contingency plan to facilitate a public Turkey for Cuba missile trade. On the 28th of October, Khrushchev received a letter from Washington assuring that Cuba would not have been invaded and that secretly missiles from Turkey would have been dismantled. In exchange, missiles from Cuba needed to be dismantled too. Khrushchev realized that the situation was going out of control, with Castro being ready for the worst and US officials wanting to encroach on Cuba since the shooting of the U-2. In this situation, the Soviet government announced that offensive arms in Cuba would have been dismantled. Khrushchev and Kennedy finally came to an agreement to put an end to this insane situation, not only for the US and USSR, but also for the whole world. On the 22nd of November, all nuclear warheads were removed from Cuba, while the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey began on the 24th of April 1963. Perhaps not everyone knows that in 1962, the world witnessed the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War and probably of the history of mankind. In fact, the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. stated this was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. As the second in command of the Soviet submarine B-59, Vasily Arkhipov calmly refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo. This decision was made despite the submarine being subjected to depth charge attacks by a US Navy task group, which included the aircraft carrier USS Randolph and 11 destroyers. His tough decision wasn't initially appreciated much in Russia, with one admiral reportedly saying it would have been better if he'd gone down with a ship. To the crew members, the world later learned that it was one of the best choices a man ever made on Earth. In 2002, Thomas S. Blanton, the director of the US National Security Archive, credited Arkhipov as the man who saved the world. The entire world was undoubtedly relieved that the nuclear war didn't become a reality. A single mistake from the US or the USSR would have made the world we know today so much different. We should never let prevarication become a threat to the life of anyone. The life of a single person is always more important than any power play, and diplomacy should always be used as a means to guarantee cordiality among international subjects.